Good evening, everyone. Thanks for joining us on our webinar, Has Inequality Broken Democracy? We'll just give a few more minutes for everybody's Zooms catching, and we'll start the webinar very shortly. Let's give another 60 seconds for the stragglers, and then we can get started. Thank you for your patience. I say stragglers, they might have been strugglers with Zoom and updates, and I should be fairer. I think we've just approached 3 minutes past 6, so I will get started now. So thank you very much for joining us, everybody. My name is Priya Sani Nicholas, and I'm one of the co-executive directors at the Equality Trust. And here at the Trust, our mission is to improve quality of life for everybody by dismantling structural inequalities of income, wealth, and power. So one of the things we want to investigate and explore is the issue of democracy and whether inequality has broken democracy. So 2024 is a really big year for democracy, not only in the UK, but around the world. We've got at least 64 nations across the world heading to the ballot boxes in 2024. And this is considered to be, one of the biggest democratic processes ever, with approximately 49% of the world's population making their voices heard. Or are they? So we also in the UK have a series of local elections here on May the 2nd, where in London we've seen the supplementary voting system abolished and introduced the first past the post the first time for our mayoral electoral system. And we're going to have a little bit of thinking about what that might mean for representation and democracy on a wider lens. And then, of course, we have the promise/threat of a general election sometime before January 2025. And what is certain, though, is that the legacy and ramifications of this global democratic process could be felt for decades to come. In the UK, we know that trust in the state and trust in the social contract that we have with the state has been eroded, or at the very least questioned. On a national scale, scandals such as Grenfell, Windrush, the COVID VIP fast lanes, the Post Office and Horizon scandal have damaged the trust that people have in our elected representatives and in the political process and practices. And on a personal level, our relationship with the state, our social contract, is also being eroded, with our exploitative and extractive system of capitalism benefiting the few. And for so many people, they have already reached the reality where work from income is not enough to support even the most meagre standard of living. And that is a growing problem that is being felt across the country by more and more people. Policy choices such as austerity, which is said to have cost the government, which is said to have cost our country over £500 billion, and our own cost of inequality report published in December last year estimated that the spend associated with the UK being as unequal as it is around £128 billion annually. The oven-ready Brexit deal, which promised to divert £350 million a week to the NHS, failed to materialise. Instead, we've seen stagnant wages that have failed to keep up with inflation and an erosion of trust in our political system, which is giving rise to far-right populism. A report earlier this year by the Fairness Foundation found that 75% of people are worried about wealth and income inequalities, with 62% worrying about the political influence of the super rich. So it's clear that this is an issue that matters a lot to a lot of people. And we can just see the numbers of people that are giving up an early evening stroll on such a beautiful night to be with us here. So on to what we're going to cover this evening. Our first speaker, Parth Patel, will be setting the scene for us, looking at the kind of current state of play and the direction of travel with who is participating in democracy in the UK. Then Matt Shaquille Mangum will be sharing with us concepts of misrepresentation and no representation. And he will start the solutions focus element of the talk tonight and introduce a vote for policies, which is a digital tool that people can use to match their policies and their values with the people that are representing them in the part of the political process. We'll then pass the mic to Stuart Donald, who will consider the first past the post voting system and how it is intrinsically linked to inequality, as well as looking at alternatives and in particular proportional representation. Our final guest is Jez Hall from Shared Future, who will explore solutions in practice, particularly how, for example, participatory budgeting can increase and broaden participation in the democratic process and why this is a good thing. We've set aside some time for questions at the end, and we're going to finish all the talks before we take these questions, but do feel free at any point in the evening to drop some questions in the chat, or if you'd like to ask your questions in person, then please raise your hand at the end and we can come to you. So without further ado, I'll pass on to our first speaker, Parth Patel. Thank you.
Hi, everyone. Thanks, Priya. Thanks for inviting me here today. I think Joe may be loading up my slides. Brilliant. So hopefully everyone can see that. I bizarrely actually can't see it. Okay, that's great.
Yeah, I can see those.
Great. So I'm really glad this seminar is happening. It's, I think, a really important question. I think probably an undervalued question, one that's probably glossed over in the general conversations, both within the inequality discourse, but also just within sort of politics in Britain writ large. So I'm going to talk a little bit about sort of the puzzle of economic inequality, the puzzle of rising income and wealth inequalities in the United Kingdom, why democracies tolerate that, and then dive into a different kind of inequality as an explanation, political inequality, that actually not everyone in this country has equal sway over the public policy process. And that is a really important reason why we have such wide economic inequality. So that's the general gist of my talk. And the reason we decided to start thinking about this IPPR was to a large extent the rise of populism. We could see sort of all around us that people, that's within the UK and outside the UK, people wanted to take back control over a political process that had allowed living standards and life expectancy to stagnate for really large numbers of citizens. And I think from that perspective, populism is less sort of surprising. It's less of a challenge to the principle of democracy, more of a challenge to the way it's practiced. People often say populism is the enemy of democracy. That's not quite true. It certainly pushes up against the kind of arrangement we have of constitutional democracy, but it's still the underlying principle is shared. And I think that's worth understanding. And I think for as long as we ignore that within the populist challenge, we'll never really tackle this issue. So my first slide, I think, great, is asking this question: why have democracies allowed economic inequality to rise and remain high? So if democracy is a collective problem-solving endeavor, then a key design principle has to be that members of that collective have equal influence over the decision-making process. That's like the fundamental principle, or one of the fundamental principles underlying democracy. It's the principle of political equality. So there are problems then if there are systematic differences in who gets their way. Now, we can't expect that everyone will always get their way, provided that there is multiple different views. Some people win, some people lose, and that's all right if you win and lose in a fairly even way. But if someone keeps winning and winning and winning because of having more power than someone else, that's concerning. The concern in a democracy like ours is that money translates into more influence. And we can see that here in this chart, because what you see here is over the past 40 years, there's a rise in income inequality, both sort of top-end inequality as well as sort of broader-based income inequality over the last 40 years. It rises and then it remains high. And that's a bit of a puzzle in a democracy. Why have citizens in a democracy allowed that to happen when the majority can see a small sort of sliver at the top seem to be much, much better off than them and pulling away? The next slide sort of puts away one of the hypotheses. So it could be that actually people's preferences just don't line up with their material interests. The average Briton doesn't actually think inequality is too high. And so there's no democratic demand to reduce it. They're quite happy for people who are rich to keep getting richer. That's not really true. 8 in 10 Britons think the income gap is too large, and low and middle income people are more likely to hold this view. This chart shows that the majority of low and middle income citizens believe the government should redistribute more. And they've consistently thought that for sort of the best part of 40 years, right? So again, despite at least 2/3 of the population, the majority of 2/3 of the population saying that we would like the government to redistribute more, we're not really seeing that. We're seeing sort of the opposite trend. And that opposite trend isn't just market forces, it's also sort of public policy choices in the tax and transfer system increasing inequality. So the next slide gets a bit closer to the answer. Why have democracies allowed inequality, economic inequality to rise and remain high? Well, it's partly because public policy is more responsive to the well-heeled than the worse off. Those at the top end of the income distribution have greater influence in the policy-making process than those in the middle and those at the bottom. You can see this, there are several studies done like this across a range of different sort of advanced liberal capitalist democracies, and this pattern's quite consistent. You see when there's a difference in opinion between high-income citizens and middle or low-income citizens, or actually highly educated graduate citizens and non-graduates, you see that public policy is consistently more responsive to the preference of the affluent and the higher educated citizens. So that's quite an interesting finding that we're seeing crop up again and again across lots of comparable advanced liberal capitalist democracies. Now, that might seem interesting from an academic perspective, but the next slide shows that people basically know this, right? People in Britain know they're not politically equal. They've known this for quite a long time. This is what this chart shows, right? Perceptions of political influence vary quite a lot depending on your social or demographic or your economic background. The bottom third of earners are almost twice as likely than the top third of earners to say people like them have no say in what the government does. Kind of a similar gradient in those who went to university and those who didn't. So this is an open secret, and it's sort of quite significant given the impacts it's probably having on policy outcomes, as well as people's perceptions of what it means to be a citizen in a democracy. So why is it happening? If that's the puzzle, why is public policy more responsive to some people rather than others? There's sort of three potential explanations here, or three potential hypotheses that we looked at in this piece of research. And this is like a very simplified version of the policymaking process. There's sort of citizens who sort of resonate their preferences and their interests and their identities to politicians who try and reflect them, and then try and convert that into policy. That's like the direct pathway, but you can also go indirectly to infect politicians through interest groups like trade unions or through lobby groups or through political parties. So this is the way in which sort of policy is generated in this country in a very simplified way. And that gives us three hypotheses. The reasons by which we get political inequality, why some people have greater influence over the decisions our government makes rather than others, could be that actually some people just speak a bit more, they're louder, or they participate more in our political processes, and therefore are heard more. There's inequalities in who speaks. That's the pink bubble. There could, however, also be inequalities in who listens. There are actually systematic differences in the opinions and interests represented by our MPs. And that then is the source of inequality, because even if everyone's speaking equally, some people are more likely to have their views reflected because MPs come from certain socioeconomic backgrounds. And then the last pathway is there's systematic differences in how citizens influence the policymaking process, because some are more likely to participate in interest groups, and certain interest groups are likely to have more power than others, right? A business lobby group might be more powerful than a charity, who might be more powerful than a small trade union. A political party, the Labour Party might be more powerful than the Green Party. And sort of there's different ways in which that sort of power is channeled up and affects policy. So I'm going to briefly look at each of these three bubbles just to sort of set the scene in terms of how political inequality is generated in this country. And then we'll pave way, I think, to the next speakers who will sort of suggest ways in which we can narrow it. So this pink bubble, inequalities in who speaks, could be behind the reason by which we have political inequality and therefore also economic inequality, or tolerate economic inequality. This quite busy slide is showing essentially who turns up to vote. It's showing trends over time. The chart on the left is showing it by various different against social and demographic groups. And you can see inequalities are growing, right? They're growing by housing tenure, they're growing by income, they're growing by occupational class, they're growing about whether you went to university or not, they're growing by your ethnicity. These gaps are sort of pulling apart at slightly different periods, but broadly towards the end of the 20th century. The chart on the right shows that in a slightly different format. It shows the average turnout gap for elections held in a particular decade. And again, you can see over time, the turnout gap is increasing by age, by income, by education, by class, by home ownership, and by ethnicity. So these gaps are growing. And if anything, they're growing even quicker. And that's quite a scary place to be, given how big some of these gaps are now. So there's a real tilt in who turns up to vote. And the hypothesis here would be, if there are differences in who's turning up to vote, that's then going to get translated into whose differences are reflected in the policymaking process. Because older people are more likely to vote and homeowners are more likely to vote, policy choices might be more likely to protect their interests than young people who haven't been to university is, for example. And I think lots of people on this call will sort of be able to sort of pin the points out. Maybe that's related to the housing problems. So that's one potential hypothesis. It's not just about voting. The next slide shows that we can see similar patterns of inequality in other kinds of political participation. So sort of other ways people can participate in our democracy formally could be writing to an MP or signing a petition, or informally by joining a protest or by boycotting certain products. I'm not going to eat meat. I'm not going to fly. These are all acts of political expression, right? Here too, we see quite stark inequalities. This chart is just splitting people by whether they went to whether they finished, when they did their A levels or whether they went to university. So it's an education split. The similar pattern, it can be seen by income, but it basically shows almost 1 in 3 university graduates has directly contacted a politician, compared to only 1 in 7 without degrees. And 1 in 10 university graduate has joined a protest, compared to fewer than 1 in 25 who didn't go to university. So again, there's that quite clear gradient in who's making their voices heard through all these kinds of means. And that is almost definitely translating into the decisions that are being made in our democracy. So it might be logical to then conclude that unequal participation is leading to unequal policy responsiveness. But correlation is not causation. And it's also plausible that if policy isn't really responding to your preferences, your needs, your interests, you might then start distrusting the political system, and you might think it's pointless to vote. So we find some evidence of this too. This chart shows basically a rise in the number of people who are saying it's not really worth voting. And that mirrors the point in the turnout. The people in the bottom third of the income distribution are 3 times more likely to say it's not worth voting compared to people in the top third of earners. So that is a really interesting finding. It's probably something we don't talk about enough. So it's not as simple as saying if you just turned up to vote, your interests would be heard. But actually, it's not true, because your interests aren't heard. You're not turning up to vote. And you get stuck in this doom loop of declining participation, declining representation. And that's one that we urgently need to break out of, I would say. So that's inequalities in who's speaking. Why don't we think about inequalities in who's listening? And if I'm running over time, please, someone should just say that. In who's listening, I'm thinking about the politicians here, our MPs. What's going on here? And I mean, the simple story here is that an individual's experience of the world shapes their view of it, right? Researchers have found politicians with working class backgrounds tend to focus more on issues relating to economic inequality compared to those from professional and business backgrounds. Across Europe, when the government cabinets had more working class ministers in it, they tend to make more generous decisions about tax and transfer on welfare spending. And you can see that analyzing basically every single government cabinet across Western European countries since the war. So that's really important. Your experience of the world shapes your view of it. And we can see here that Parliament is not a representative image of this country, right? There are gaps everywhere, particularly in terms of who's gone to university and if they come from working class background or not. But there's also gaps in terms of whether they're men or women, or and whether they're minority ethnic background or not. And so you see these gaps, and that's another reason through which political inequality can be generated. The next slide shows how these patterns are changing over time. So you've seen real improvements in the representation of women in Parliament. It's not done, but it's absolutely trending in the right direction, and that will continue. You've seen less progress in terms of education. The bottom left chart shows sort of as kind of the gap between the general population who goes to university and MPs who go to university is pretty much fixed. But the chart on the right is the most profound. It shows a precipitous drop in the number of MPs who come from working class backgrounds. It's fallen twice as quickly as the size of the working class population in this country. And that's caused quite a big representation gap for working class interest in public policy making, which again goes back to the problem we started at. Why is it that we have such rising or tolerating rising and high economic inequality? You kind of see this evidence in the next chart as well, which is looking not just at the social and demographic characteristics of parliamentarians, but actually their views. And what this slightly complicated chart shows is that the economic attitudes of MPs most closely mirror the views of affluent citizens. So, put simply, if those with decision-making power come from affluent backgrounds and then also hold attitudes that most closely mirror people of high-income backgrounds, then it's not really that surprising that policy is most responsive to the preferences of those groups. So that's a really important bit. And that's where I think the academics are saying, actually, this is a really important node of inequality and one that we should be paying a lot more attention to if we were serious about trying to reduce political equality and all the sort of manifestations and consequences of that. The final slide is the sort of the murkiest of the nodes in the story. I've called it who amplifies, because parties and interest groups can amplify certain people's interests and preferences over others. But how exactly they do that is quite complicated. To start with the parties, party memberships have not just shrunk, which is something that everyone knows, but they've become a lot less representative of the country. Men, middle-class men, white middle-class men are massively overrepresented in virtually every political party. And that will have some kind of consequence for the sorts of issues that parties decide to champion and not to champion in setting the agenda there. And that is a source for inequality about whose interests are measured. But it's not just the memberships, right? Because not all members are equal. Some members put in a lot more money than others. And I'm thinking particularly of donors here. The kind of party system we have relies on people donating money. So the next slide will show you just how concentrated the funding of political parties are here. For Tories, for the Lib Dems, for the Labour Party, the largest 10% of donations account for over half of the total amount of money that party gets. So that's quite a lot of power in quite a small number of donors. So you've got shrinking members and concentrating donors at the same time. That, I think, should be cause concern. So the chart on the right shows how sort of concentration within party donations are increasing. It essentially suggests that parties may be amplifying a smaller group or a less diverse group of voices than they once did, and potentially a more affluent and wealthier group. All that stuff is quite hard to completely join the dots on. We're doing some work on that right now. But given how important political parties are in our democracy, the fact that their memberships have shrunk and their donors have concentrated is almost certainly a cause of political inequality and keeps certain issues on the agenda and certain issues off the agenda. That money's going further. So the next slide, and this is my penultimate slide, shows that the relationship between how much you spend in a campaign and the number of votes you win in your patch has increased. So the more you spend, the more votes you get. That's kind of true for the long history of British politics, but now each pound goes a bit further. This is important because the election spending limits have just been raised by 80%. And so that may well have some sort of influence, particularly in the swing constituencies, if one party is spending more than the other party. And that again comes back to the point about, well, who's donating to whom? And there's a big question there about how that leads to political inequality. The last slide is just to show it's not just about sort of money doesn't just help you get certain people elected and therefore represent certain views. It can also be used to lobby existing parliamentarians. And jobs aren't quite the same as lobbying, but there's obviously an ongoing conversation about the conflict of interest that may be associated with having second jobs. And it'll be interesting to see if there is a change in government after the next election, what that government does about this issue. It's sort of been in the news a long time, and there have been various commitments to try and act on it. Where the point here is to, I think, get across two things. Just how common this is. 1 in 5 MPs has quite substantial earnings from the private sector. and just how much it is, right? At the moment, the latest data show the average Tory MP is making around £40,000 on top of their MP salary if they've got a second job. So based on that, I think I will come to a close. There's quite a lot of information there, but the general story I was trying to tell is if we want to try and understand the puzzle of rising income and wealth inequality in a democracy like the UK, we have to think much harder about political inequality, why some people seem to have greater influence on the political process than others. And trying to explain that is not simple, but it's multifaceted, but each of those requires, I think, policy movements.
Thank you very much. That was really insightful and helpful in understanding kind of the background of what's going on and how we've got into the situation we're in, and highlighting some parts of that situation that maybe we haven't always been looking at, but figuring out where, diagnosing the problem so that we can think about where to focus attention and efforts into trying to find a way around it. So the next person we're going to invite to come and speak for us is Matt, who's going to talk to us about kind of the concepts of misrepresentation, no representation, and then this tool that he's developed called Vote for Policies that helps to mitigate against those risks. Matt.
Hi, everyone. Let me just move you over there. Yeah, thanks, Path. That's a really interesting opener. There's definitely a sense of urgency to the situation, and also there's a kind of particular lens on why we're where we are. I want to bring to the urgency a sense of possibility as well. So my name's Matt Shokel-Mangan. I've run Vote for Policies, which is a voter advice tool. I've run it for the past 4 general elections. So admittedly, I'm focusing in on participation in the general election. That's not the extent of political participation or democratic participation. It's a very, very narrow aspect of it. But hopefully we'll see that there's application more wider. So the first thing I'm going to do is actually just show you what the tool is. It's not in an attempt to make it a kind of sales thing. It's really just to introduce the notion of voter advice tools, and the rest of the talk is about voter advice tools more generally. So I'm just going to hop into this one. So Vote for Policies works. It's pretty simple. There's no algorithms, but essentially users choose issues that they care about. So democracy, economy, education, environment. They could choose all of the issues that we've chosen, and they let's say they choose these, selecting the country that they're from, and then these are based on the 2019 manifestos. There were 5 main parties in England in 2019. For this year, there's likely to be just 4, but we're just focusing on the parties that have representation in pretty much every constituency. All the user has to do is really just read the policy points. We've hidden the name of the party. And if this is something that you think you could get behind and vote for, you can add it to your shortlist. And if it's something that you just absolutely would never consider, you can say no thanks. And you do that for the rest of the parties until you get to a shortlist, and then you just make your final choice. You often, admittedly, you're choosing the least worst, but these are the choices you have. We'll come back to that point, and then away you go, and then on to the next issue that you've chosen to compare policies about. So I'm not going to go through the whole thing, but you'll end up with some sort of results page, kind of like this. So here, the user has compared policies over 5 issues, like I did just there, and you can see which parties they chose. You can see they're sort of leaning towards the Green Party, but actually you might care more about the specific issues that you chose. It might be just that democracy is really important to you, so that would make you lean towards Liberal Democrats. Whatever is involved in you making an informed choice, that's what we're trying to help with. And obviously then you can do some more interesting things and join some campaigns and we had a few actions there. So I'm going to come back to the point of it all. Just want to run you through this. So the problem we're trying to solve is low turnout. And again, we're obviously focusing on general elections, but it's low turnout and poor information. The goal being to increase turnout and make sure people can vote in a more informed basis. Personally, the first time I ever read a manifesto was in 2009, and I realised I'd been voting for parties that I just did not agree with. But when I did know which party I agreed with, I actually felt more inclined to vote. So the aim of Vote for Policies and voter advice tools in general is to improve knowledge and confidence among voters. Our particular method of doing that is to use this kind of comparison, blind comparison, focusing just on the main parties. The graph in the middle shows the kind of numbers we get. It's a volunteer-run organisation. It's not funded, so we don't do any marketing. And we can expect about 1 million users this year, maybe more, who knows? But that's still less than 2% of the electorate. What is interesting is research from Kantar that showed, so they did a sample using this particular method of comparison on a nationally representative sample group, and found that 35% said they were more likely to vote, with the rest as likely to vote. So that does suggest that the more people we can reach with this and other tools like this, if the focus is on improving knowledge and confidence, then the more people we reach, the more people will vote. The fact that 50% of people said that they were surprised by the results does also talk to this kind of misrepresentation concept, where those that are voting, that have some degree of representation, are misrepresented because they're actually voting for parties to whom they're not particularly aligned. So there's a real information problem there, and a need for some non-partisan information. That's kind of emphasized by the fact that 20% of people said that they were likely to even change their vote, which is really significant. It doesn't actually favor one particular party. You may be surprised or pleased or not pleased to hear. It doesn't mean people are more likely to vote for more left-leaning parties, or they're more likely to vote for more right-leaning parties. Actually, the change was pretty much level across the board. So really, why I want to show this is because I think there are things that we can do by putting information in the hands of citizens. If we can be more joined up and collaborative in how we do this, and if tools like Vote for Policies can become better and more accessible, and better funded, then we've actually got a chance. We've got a model here that shows that we can engage people and help them feel confidence and a sense of agency, which we know leads to participation. Now, the other thing that we found in doing this was there've been a lot of different graphs tonight. So this is introducing a new stacked bar chart for the fans of graphs here. The number on the bottom shows how many issues users typically compare parties against. So let's take that example that I just did. I chose 5 different issues. So if you look at the bar chart for the number 5, the color coding relates to how many parties you're likely to choose. So obviously the biggest area being the kind of yellow. So the average is actually 3.5. So you're likely to choose 3 or 4 different parties, even if you're just comparing across 6 issues. So this really introduces another concept of misrepresentation. It's the kind of the handoff between giving people the information to make a proper, informed decision, and actually, in having that knowledge, being far more likely to vote in the first place. So that's a great step forward. But then there's another issue, which comes down to the voting system. So whatever voting system we have, it must take into account the fact that we have multiple preferences for different parties across different issues. So I'll close now, but I want to be really clear. We can close the representation gap. We can do far more than we're doing. Funding and the general lack of a democracy sector is a massive issue. But I feel if we use more voter advice tools, then that's a really positive thing. So share them, share the ones that you think are good. I'm not talking about sort of tactical voting or anything that's trying to sway people to vote for one party or another, like non-partisan voter advice tools. Also, integrating these tools with campaign organizations. In the case of Vote for Policies, we can now actually create customized versions of the quite generic survey that we've got, but we can go deeper into certain issues. So if you're a campaign organization, we can create more focused surveys on the issues that matter to you, your organization and your members. And I'm pleased to say we're actually doing this with the Equality Trust. So you'll see a more equality focused survey coming soon. So that's a really another important way that we can get more of these tools to more people and make them more relevant. So it'd be great to do this with campaign organizations that actually represent those groups that we know are much less likely to vote. We've already done one with Generation Rent, supporting renters, because we know they're much more unlikely to vote. Younger people, some minority ethnic groups and low-income groups. Those are the people we need to get these tools to. The third thing is listen to Stuart, who's coming up next. And Stuart's going to talk more about that role of the voting system in this concept of misrepresentation. On that note, I will thank you all for listening. And Stuart, over to you.
Okay, thank you very much. Let me just get my...
And unless I've just squeezed out Priya, who wanted to say something, but I've just bypassed
I
you.
loved that. I loved that segue. Thank you very much, Matt.
I'm absolutely honoured. I wasn't anticipating being teed up by another speaker. So thank you very much, and thanks to the Equality Trust for giving me the opportunity to speak about this subject. So my subject is, as per the top of my slide, looking at this link between the first past the post system and the UK's very acute levels of inequality. So I'm going to speak for about 15-20 minutes. The background to my research, I'm a researcher by trade, is to look at first past the post against proportional representation. And what I do is I look at the UK's most relevant peer group, so the 3 Anglosphere countries and the 11 most relevant Northwestern European countries. So that underpins what I'm going to talk about here. I hadn't planned to go over the systems in any great detail. Most people are probably familiar with the 2 big groups of systems. So proportional representation on the left, it does what it says in the tin. 25% of a vote, 25% share of the vote achieved by parties should result in 25% of the seats. You typically don't get majority parties winning power on their own in PR, and the character of government is dominated by coalitions as a result of the fact that parties need to come together to form governments. And the first past the post system on the right is one of the major majoritarian systems. So that meaning that if your party gets 25% of the vote, it probably will not get 25% of the seats. In most cases, it would be less. And then other things that people are probably familiar with, that people complain about. So if you vote for a party that loses, your votes are lost. There are fewer parties that typically can get to power. Parties can achieve majorities with minority shares of the vote. So I think people recognize those things. One of the things I find frustrating is whilst those things are cited often as being bad things and things that should be addressed, they tend to get dismissed and considered to be sort of almost nice to haves, marginal, if you want, considerations against the much bigger ticket day job type concerns for government. So health, and education. But what I'm planning to show here is that actually when you bring these things together in a sort of jigsaw, you can see how each of these things contributes to the appalling levels of inequality we experience in the UK. So where does it start? Well, it starts with the fact that, as I touched on there, the first part of the post system produces two electable parties. Right? Why does that happen? It happens because voters would appear over time, if they're prepared to vote, to want to make sure that their votes count. And so what they do is they will then look to select a party that's going to get elected. And that then means that other parties get eliminated, and over time, dominant parties emerge. There's a feedback loop where those parties are able to invest themselves in their dominant position. And that's it. You end up with only two parties that can achieve power. So the graph on the right is showing you over the 40 years from 1980, a comparison between the first past the post countries at the bottom and the PR countries at the top. So the four countries at the bottom each are showing that they've only been able to vote into power two parties, apart from the UK, obviously, with the Lib Dems having achieved a coalition with the Tories in 2010, but that's very rare. And then at the top, the 11 PR countries, all showing that more parties have been involved in government, mostly through coalitions, some through single-party minority governments, on average 6 or 7 parties. So this is an absolutely crucial building block to then understand why it is our system, the first past the post system, drives such staggering levels of inequality. So there are 4 things that I'm going to walk through here that try and explain, how the end game works out. So the first thing is that if you've only got 2 parties, then you've only got 2 coalitions of voters, right? So this is going to sound a bit glib, but effectively, the voters have decided there are 2 parties, and they then have to prepare policy agendas and manifestos for their voters. Because these groups are so big, then it comes down to pretty basic economic circumstances. So on the right, you've got the haves. And so they're people that think they've got something to lose. They've got income that can be taxed. They have houses. They have other elements of wealth. They want their governments to conserve, leave them alone, do as little as possible. They don't want them spending money on things they don't need. Okay, again, these are generalizations, but they're to make out the point, and you'll recognize most of this in your experience of the UK. And on the left, the have-nots, the people that consider themselves to have possibly less to lose, maybe nothing to lose. They want their government to support them, invest in public services, and that probably means taxing wealthier people more. Very different from what happens in PR countries, right? Because in PR countries, the voters know there are more than 2 parties that are credible, right? There are more than 2 parties that, if you vote for them, will achieve power. I'm depicting there are 5, but as discussed earlier, more than that in normal circumstances. And that then means the coalitions that support these parties are themselves narrower and smaller. And this is where you get this other thing that comes out of PR. People can actually vote for parties that represent what they would like. And that's what's depicted here. And the crucial thing is that these countries, the PR countries, like the UK, they all have their haves and have-nots. They've all got that sort of basic economic cleavage. But that is not the characteristic that dominates the policy agenda over time. That's what's sort of depicted here at the bottom, a classic sort of coalition between progressives, Greens, and Liberals. And you can see how that group could sort of straddle a number of different war groups. So, second problem with only having 2 parties emerges when you realise that one group is bigger than the other. One group has more voters than the other. And this is some of the stuff that the guys touched on earlier. And that group is the haves, right? So you can sort of prove out to some extent that in Western wealthy countries, there are more people that would consider themselves haves. If you take the OECD's definition of middle income for the UK, that's 58% of the population. Add the higher income, then that gets to 70%. That's, again, a bit of a crude generalization, but you can infer the same sort of thing when you look at property ownership and also social grading, A, B, and C1. The haves look like a bigger group. The have-nots, however, are not only smaller, but they're impaired by, particular what the guys were saying before, by the fact that we've learned recently, not only since the war has participation in elections gone down, but the people that are most likely to drop out of participating are the disenfranchised, the people lower down the income scale. And the new evidence has shown that if you live in an unequal country, then that impact is even higher again, particularly countries that have high inequality like the UK. So the bottom line is the haves have an advantage. The first past the post system up to this point is biased in favour of the wealthier voters. And so this bar here you've got against voter share is telling you that over the last 11 elections, so that's since 1980, the Tories have won 8, right? So that's the first, if you want, piece of proof that sort of like proves that out. And when they win elections, on average, they achieve 42% of the vote. Again, corroborating the point about the haves being a bigger group. But what is obvious to everyone, and this is another one of these things that's known about the system, is that's a minority victory. That we should not entitle one party to have the ability to stridently, implement, prosecute policy ideas in the way that we know has happened in the UK. And this happens because of the third thing I'm going to point to, which I'm calling the first past the post leverage effect, is that if you've only got two parties, when they get above a certain level of the popular vote, the 35%, as it is in the UK on average over the last 40 years, then that entitles that party typically to upwards of 50% of the seats. So this is where you get this exaggerated phenomenon. It happens in other countries. In New Zealand, between the war and 1995, I think there were only 9 years when they had their Labour Party in power, the other 41, their National Party, so the equivalent of the Conservative Party. And you'll be aware of in other scenarios. But none of this explains necessarily specifically why inequality should have gone up over the last 40 years. We're not saying that just because it's been a Tory government, that necessarily equates to inequality. So this chart here is tracking, and I think Parth had something similar to this. It's tracking the extent to which the wealthiest 1% in society command national income. And it's showing you the yellow line is the average of the wealthy 1% in PR countries, and the red line is the same for the PR countries. So you can see from left to right that a fantastic job has been done since the end of the First World War until 1980 in equalising society and bringing inequality down, to the extent that in 1980, the UK was second only to Sweden in Europe, being one of the most equal countries in the world. And you think about how the establishment plays back the 1970s to us today, that it was a bit of a mess with lots of strikes and power cuts and strife and so on. In actual fact, there were millions of people that were enjoying higher levels of better quality of life than had ever been and has been at a great extent since then. And so why did this happen in the UK, and why would it be then, off the back of what I've just been saying, that these two lines should be tracking each other most exactly? So in the UK, from the war until 1980, there was this consensus around what was called butt-skillism. So the two chancellors, Tory one Labour, that were deemed to be responsible for this consensus. And the consensus was that we invest in the welfare state, that we invest in health, that we invest in society, that we invest in public services. And this is what drove that improvement in quality of life for so many people as measured in this way. And then, of course, in 1980, it all finishes. And you can see both for the PR countries and the first past the post countries, there's an increase in inequality. However, for the first past the post countries, the increase is very marked. Right? And this is because of the adoption of neoliberalism. So I'm calling this a consensus. I'll talk about the fact that obviously it was introduced by the Tories, led by them, but then embraced by the Labour Party further ahead as well. So this is the fourth major thing that I'm saying is driving inequality, and it's all because of the way the mechanism of our system works. Just quickly to look at some of then the truth behind that. So these two charts are showing you healthcare spend and welfare spend over the 4 decades since 1980. The white bar is the UK, the red are the other first past the post countries, and the yellow bar is PR countries. So basically, you can see the effect of the adoption of these ideas where the state spends less, regulates less, effectively does less, in the spending levels there. So per head of population, the UK spent something like 30% less than the average PR country over those 4 decades. So you think about the scale of that sum of money and the impact that would have, between two sets of countries on welfare and then inequality. And the other thing to point out, going back to this controversial use of the term consensus, that from a previous slide, is that obviously the Labour Party did not endorse this idea of the state spending less, anything but in the 1980s. It was very much against it. But eventually, as we know, Blair and Brown came to the view that in order to get elected, they were going to have to start aligning with some of these ideas, which is what they did. And then they got elected with 3 huge majorities, 13 years in power, arguably the most powerful progressive mandate anyone's achieved since the Second World War. And then you look at this graph and it sort of shows you that they look like, well, there was very little difference between what they were doing compared to the Thatcher era before them and then the austerity era after that. So this is where the first past the post system not only empowers the Tories to be as strident and as dominant as they are, but it also emasculates, it renders less potent the ability of our progressive voice, and we've only got 2 parties and only one of them, in terms of addressing things like inequality. Now, that would matter if the well-being statistics were parallel between us and our PR peers, but they're not. One of the darkest ones is the child mortality statistics. You can see there again, the UK lags the PR peers. Again, bring at the point in 2000, 2009, our establishment tend to allow us to think that the Labour Party was progressive and invested and did things social democratic, and it did in terms of investment compared to the Tories that preceded them. But 2006, the UK was leapfrogged by Ireland as being the country with the worst child mortality stats in that peer group of Northwest Europe. That's little Ireland that had been unrecognisable in terms of its poverty 20 or 30 years before that. And now the UK is down with Bulgaria, Romania, Croatia, and I think Slovakia with one of the worst levels of child mortality. So most of the rest of the Eastern European countries 30 years ago that had been tied up with the failed sort of communist model already ahead of the UK. So likewise, the stats on life expectancy tell the same story. You could tell the same story through cancer recovery and so on. This is the consequence of a system that hugely empowers one party with, the wrong sort of, if you want, political model. In this case, these vestiges of neoliberalism I've been talking about. So my last slide just really summarizes that. The only way out of this, in my view, is that we need to move to PR, or we need to hope that what comes after neoliberalism is a consensus that allows us to start addressing inequality. So that was my talk. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Stuart. That's fascinating and some, real food for thought there. I'm going to head straight over now to our final speaker. We've got kind of 35 minutes left, so I'm not sure how long you would like, Jez, but it would be great to leave, maybe 20 or so minutes for questions if we could at the end. If anybody does have any questions, please do start putting those in the chat or writing them out, and we can put your hand up when we come to the end bit. Jez, over to you.
Thank you, and thank you to all the other speakers. Some really fascinating statistics there, and I hope the audience will be pleased to hear I don't have any graphs in my presentation. I do probably have some technical problems, so if you bear with me whilst I shift between one screen share and the other. And I'm going to mainly be focusing on another aspect of democracy, which is about local participation, on the basis that often democracy is a conversation told about people at the top, but actually it's about how we participate in our neighbourhoods and our communities, where I believe, and where my organisation Shared Future believes, democracy should emerge from. As long as people see it as a game being played by others, they're less likely to participate. So how do we bring democracy as close as possible to the people. So I'm going to start first with a video about participatory budgeting, concept that some of you may have heard about, may not be so familiar. Hopefully you'll hear about a little bit more in the future. So this is a 3 or 4 minute video from New York, the city of New York, filmed a few years ago, about their attempts to shift power over particular resources towards citizens through this technique of participatory budgeting, which first emerged in Latin America in the 1980s.
You live in this community and you pay taxes, come out and vote and decide how your tax dollars get spent.
Participatory budgeting is a different way to engage with government and to decide how tax dollars are spent. It's giving people real power over real money to make the decisions that affect their lives.
The reality is who knows better about their community than the people that live in their community. Nobody else can make a decision about what you need more than the person that's dealing with it. Oh, this is different because you're actually voting for where the money is going to be spent instead of allowing them to decide where to spend the money.
So how does it work? First, people brainstorm ideas. They come together in neighborhood assemblies and start to think of what kinds of projects would they like to see in their neighborhood. Volunteers take people's initial ideas and turn them into real projects.
We started with maybe about 40 projects, and so we had a series of budget delegate meetings, and we narrowed down the list into about 4 or 5 projects.
What are the real needs of the community? If you only have a certain amount of money, what is it that you can do that's going to benefit as many people as possible?
Bus countdown clocks.
I'm dreaming of added benches, new benches. Seniors have nowhere to go.
People actually get a taste of governing in their city, of making the tough decisions and coming up with things that can be done to improve their community. And they bring them back to the public for a vote.
So we're validating every voice in our community and saying, you know what, whatever your position is, you live in our community, you have a right to decide, and that me as a representative and government should respond and should listen to that voice.
The projects with the most votes get funded.
We have the playground improvements at Millbrook.
They're then implemented over the next few years, and the following year, the process starts again. People brainstorm new ideas, turn them into new projects, vote on them, and fund more improvements for their community. PB becomes part of the budget process. It becomes a new way of governing.
I think this is like the greatest wave of democracy coming into the United States. Where it started was in Porto Alegre, Brazil in 1989.
From there, it spread all over Brazil, Latin America, and at this point, over 1,500 cities around the world, and increasingly in North America.
This was a great opportunity for you to be a part of government and better the city you live in. And who wouldn't want to take advantage of that?
You're creating a more educated platform of voters overall. So I think this can only be good for the big project of democracy.
So I'm just going to stop the share there, and I will bring up my main presentation, and I will keep this to time. Please let me know that you can see this all right on screen, Priya or someone else. Can you just say that's okay? So participatory budgeting, as I think that film shows, is about giving people actual agency over the money that is spent in their communities. Not the whole budget by any means. It's generally a small proportion of, often capital investment budgets, but also can be service budgets. And it's been a process that's been tried in the UK, particularly in Scotland, where they now have a national commitment still running that 1% of local authority budgets will be spent through a direct participatory process like participatory budgeting, where people can come up with their own ideas or respond in community forums to ideas emerging from other policy forums, develop those, propose those, share them, vote on them, and then actual spend happens. And that immediacy, that ability for people to take part in these processes, I think are good for the wider electoral system. And there's lots of evidence that people who have participated in these processes have higher trust in government, and therefore are more likely to vote, and are therefore more likely to close some of the inequality gaps that some of the other speakers have spoken about. So participatory budgeting is local people making decisions about how to spend public money. And if it's done well, it should be empowering and not manipulating those citizens. So it's about real decisions. It's about saying, what assets do we have in our community, but what assets do we need to build to have a fairer and more equal society? You could think of it as a democratic budget for the whole community. So it's not about people voting necessarily just for personal interest, but to listening to other members of their community, hearing what is important to other people, and then in a collective process coming together to make decisions. And it's never a one vote process. It's never, I want this project. It's always got some degree of proportionality in it, because you have to vote for a number of projects for any one vote to count. So it's about real money. It is about real money being transferred outside of the representative democracy system into a participatory democracy system, with real decisions taken by citizens face to face or online, but they can actually see that their participation made a difference. And as somebody from Brazil, it was referenced, it came from Brazil, said many years ago, if it feels like we've decided, it's participatory budgeting. And if it feels like someone else has decided, it isn't. And so it's very much about, do you feel you have agency and voice, and does your participation lead to change? It's that immediacy is one of its great powers. There's two basic models that have been tried within the UK. You heard from the USA, where that's what we would call mainstream on the whole. So project ideas are actually implemented by the city. So it's not about taking money out of the public budget, it's about redirecting it within that public budget. And that might be the community-led commissioning, where local people directing public services, directing where their taxes go in a very direct and immediate way. But the other model that's most common in the UK is what we would call sometimes participatory grant making. So that might be that there's a fund in your community of, say, £50,000. People can apply for up to £5,000 for a project idea, quite small sums maybe, and then all those ideas are brought to a public space, and you can come along, you can bring all your neighbours and friends along, and everybody can listen to each other's projects and vote upon those projects. And that's what we're trying to develop, is an idea that democracy isn't about some abstract thing at a distance. It's something that you do in your community and in your neighborhood. And we know, and we've heard some of the trends that we've seen already. So we've seen austerity has been the major sort of narrative for many years, and we've seen the massive cuts that have happened within public sectors. And this slide from Jericho, the Raft and the Juicer, kind of talks about what happens when things are in crisis. And one of the deep effects of austerity is that government has stopped listening outside itself. It's wrestling with its internal problems. Basically, what services do we cut next? Who are we going to throw off this raft next? So this is one of our fundamental problems with our democracy, is that government, particularly public government, particularly at the local level, has been wrestling with decisions about how it restructures itself. And that has led it to be not listening to what everyday people want, and not responding to those pressures, and has created this sort of competitive and rather doom-laden politics of want rather than the politics of opportunity. We also have this other massive thing that's happening, which is our climate breakdown. And this is a story that certain parties have been pushing, but what we know is that those who are most affected by climate change on a global scale, but also on a UK scale, are those most least likely to be actually producing those problems. And we've got this trend, which is going to only get worse, is that those who can take action, who can respond, who can transition effectively, are likely to be the wealthiest. So we've got this trend which is working against equality. Climate justice is a social justice issue too. And finally, we've got this massive democratic deficit. We've got this distrust and populism that other people have talked about, and how that leads to a kind of political contention that leads people away from wanting to vote, wanting to participate. If people feel this is a negative story all the time, that it's about powerful people fighting it out, then I think that's how we are going to undermine our story, our democracy. And we have to start telling some better stories about where we're going to be living in the future, stories that are less about violence, which we just look at as passive sort of observers. There's been some real trends on the opposite side of this. So we've seen a shift away from ideas of charity, where we kind of are grateful from the money that comes from above, and we're moving towards a sort of society that's based more around how do we cooperate at a local level, how can we build together. Social entrepreneurship is one of these concepts, basically coming together within groups. So how do we build alliances between people to work towards building a stronger and better society for everywhere, not a charitable society where some have lots and most have little. We've also seen cooperation and trust as a positive solution to inequality. We've seen over many years that people have become frustrated by stories like the tragedy of the commons, the fact that we can't share resources, that people are basically selfish. And again, that's a sort of neoliberal narrative which has taken great sway. But we've seen the rise of new thoughts about how we could form a collective commons, and participatory budgeting is a visible kind of experience of our commons. People come together to make practical decisions in a very real way about their community, and they see how many other people also want to make positive change happen in a non-party political way. People just like them who've got ideas and solutions to local problems that is not about competing for scarce resources being given by powerful people somewhere else. And a lot of this is about how do we model good democratic behaviours. Little story I could tell, schools on the average don't share their budgets with their pupils, but parents do actually share money with their children. They give pocket money. They give pocket money because it allows those young people to learn about budgeting. They give pocket money because it stops the pest of power, so it makes for a more peaceful sort of family setup. But it also allows those young people to experiment and play with resources and become autonomous and citizens with agency. So why do our institutions like schools, why are they so undemocratic? Could we not move towards a system where schools actually shared physical resources, money, with pupils, and allowed those pupils to help design the schools? And if I had more time, I'd show some really wonderful films of how that has happened in practice. So what we're trying to do with our work on participatory budgeting is trying to turn this narrative around and say, how can we actually use the systems where people can participate in democracy in a practical way themselves to form relationships between people within community, to move community from an idea of a place to an actual set of behaviours, a verb about how we could work together. We know that by bringing people together, by building social capital, we can create resilience within our societies. The state does so many great things, but it's actually people caring for their neighbours. We saw a lot of that in the narratives around COVID, about mutual aid and support. A lot of that is about creating spaces for people to talk to each other. And our general politics is all about creating divisions between people and isolating them from people with perhaps common ideas. We heard some of the talks about the policy kind of online tool where people are actually much more similar than we think, and that people are not so divided. So how could we rebuild democracy by actually making our democratic practice more equal, and by modeling democracy at home, at school, in our community, in our local authority, and not see democracy as a game where power flows down from above, but rather emerges from the bottom. So that's all of my slides. I hope I kept pretty much to time, and thank you, everybody.
Well, thank you, Jez. Yes, you kept perfectly to time, and I loved the way you ended, you know, talking about the democracy shouldn't be something that's kind of its power coming from above trickling down to the bottom. It should be something that we've all got a stake in, we've all got a share in. So thanks. What a great way to end the session, or end the presentation element of the session. So we've got 20 minutes left of our allotted time. It would be good to wrap up on time. So if we've got any questions, please do either raise your hand or put them in the chat. While people are readying themselves up with hand raising and chat box texting, I might start with a couple of questions. So this can be a question for everybody. It was kind of picked up from something that Parth said in his talk. He said, populism isn't the enemy of democracy. So maybe we could ask each of our panelists, we can start with Jez, as he was the last to speak there, you know, well, who is the enemy of democracy, and who might our saviour of democracy be?
Populism, it's got a very negative term, hasn't it? It sounds like people are being manipulated, and actually what we're talking about really is about people coming together and saying what they want. I think a lot of our voting in our society is voting for negative things, saying what we don't want. So real populism is about saying, well, how can we elevate ideas and ideas that emerge from the grassroots, from people's everyday lived experience about how to make their lives better. So what I would like is a more popular democracy, populated by human beings, by people who are not hiding behind rosettes or ballot box sort of sound bites.
Sorry, thank you. Stuart, do you want to think about who is the enemy of democracy and who is the hero of democracy, or who could be the hero of democracy?
I totally agree with Parth that populism is certainly not the enemy of democracy. Has to be able to embrace, you know, all sorts of things, including that, and ideally the political system is just able to do that. You know, so again, back to the stuff I was talking about, a PR system's much better equipped to manage this, because what happens is populism can emerge more quickly and seems to be more visible. So what's happened in the Netherlands, what happened in the previous decade in Poland, you could argue what's happening in Italy. It's better managed and harnessed with the wider mix of views in a PR system. So I certainly, you know, think it would be dangerous to be suggesting that that's the case. Obviously, if taken to extremes, then, you know, anything is going to be dangerous for democracy. But per se, it's certainly not.
Thank you. Ruth, you've got your hand up. Shall we head to you, and then we can maybe come back to that question?
Okay. So I've already put something in the chat about this, but one way to make people much more equal would be a universal basic income, which would be taxable just like any other income. We already have something very similar for children, which is the child benefit. All children, with some minor exceptions, most of which are bad, do get the child benefit. Their parents may spend it on their behalf, but it is to be spent on them and not on, and it's normally paid to the mother because she's more likely to spend it that way and not misuse it. I hope the men don't feel slighted by this. So I don't know what other people think about this.
I mean, that would certainly, you know, go some way towards, you know, equaling out and you know, the kind of distribution of income and transfer of wealth from different groups to evening out inequalities on that kind of economic scale, and I think that's, you know, certainly one of the things that's, or looking at universal basic income as part of a universal basic services package is something that the, you know, the Equality Trust is kind of looking at.
Good.
I'm just going to try and keep, if we can, to kind of democracy for this webinar, if that's okay, but we can definitely touch base on that again some other time. Ruth. Mary, you had your hand up.
Yes, I agree with that. The other thing about UBI is that it would save a lot of unnecessary bureaucracy, people having to claim.
Yeah.
It's what somebody called rubbish jobs. I can't remember. That's not quite right. But don't forget that they've removed benefits for the third child. I think that should be abolished as well.
Yeah, that is one of our campaign.
If you're poor, you're going to be poorer if you've got more children.
Yeah, that is one of our manifesto asks. Thank you for that, Mary. So just another broad question, maybe we can go to some of the people that didn't have a chance to talk on that last one I put that was a more broad. Do any of our speakers or anyone in the you know, as one of any of our guests as well have any thoughts around mandatory voting? Would that make a difference? Parth, you discussed the fact. I think it was you. I think maybe more than you as well. You kind of talked about the fact of who's voting, and you know, if older people are voting and homeowners are more likely to vote, then the people, you know, developing policies are more likely to develop policies that suit them. So would mandatory voting make a difference?
Yeah, I'll come in on that. I mean, it's a great question, and I think it's worth deliberating on. And there's no right or wrong answer to this, right? This is the sort of thing that I think constitutional policy is quite different to ordinary politics, right? And it should be debated in a different way, and it shouldn't be sort of up to politicians to be able to decide the rules that govern them. That should be done by a different way. And I think mandatory voting is an interesting thing to discuss. It obviously happens in some comparable countries, like Australia. It depends on the problem. Like, it depends what the question is. What is, if mandatory voting is a solution, what's the question? If the question is one of material, economic, wealth and income inequality, I don't think mandatory voting is going to touch that. If the question is why there seems to be a dissipation of democratic culture or participation in old school institutionalized forms of politics, voting among young people, will mandatory voting help? Maybe, right? So it depends, I think, on what your justification is. I certainly wouldn't see it as a panacea. I don't know if you want me to come back on to the other 2 points that came up about.
Yeah, why not? You're speaking. Oh, unless you, Ruth or Jez, particularly wanted to speak to mandatory voting.
I'll come in first. I mean, I think we're all disappointed by how many people don't vote. And there is a sort of an idea that if we could encourage more people to vote, and particularly if people who are more socially disadvantaged, marginalized, then that would help. However, I kind of feel it's again focusing on the citizen as on those marginalized people as the problem. And really the problem is we don't have positive incentives to vote. So I would be really interested in how we can make voting more attractive rather than tackle the problem with this sort of blunt instrument.
Oh, like that.
What would be the benefit of lowering voting ages, for example? Perhaps a bit too controversial to say we should have a maximum voting age, at which point, you know, people shouldn't. But the point is, how do we broaden participation in different spaces and give people practice in voting? A lot of people might vote in a local space for something that matters to them, and through that pick up the habits of becoming active citizens. So for me, it's about how do we not punish unactive citizens? How do we actually move to supporting positive people who wanted to make change happen?
Thank you. Good suggestions there. I like those. Sorry, Ruth, did you want to come in on mandatory voting or lowering voting age?
Yes, mandatory voting, I think, is a good idea. Basically, unless somebody's in hospital and unconscious, they should be expected to turn up to the polling station and to mark. They can put in a blank ballot paper or write none of the above and spoil it that way, and nobody will ever know who did it. But it means they have to think about whether they want to choose and what the advantage might be of actually choosing. And the other thing that I think is important, not so much as lowering the voting age when nearly everyone now stays at school till 18, or in some form of education, but that schools should teach this sort of thing, that there should be mock elections within schools. And I was the mock election candidate for the Liberal Party, as it then was, many years ago. I think the Conservatives won, and we came second, and the Labour Party, who actually had Cressida Gaitskell as their candidate, came third, which showed a distressing tendency for people to vote the same way as their parents did. It was a school that contained a mixture of fee-paying places and pupils who were there on a direct grant from the government. I was one of those, but it did at least mean that we all had a rough idea what voting was about before we left school.
Thank you, Ruth, for sharing that. Matt, you've got something you wanted to add?
Yeah, just on the mandatory voting. I mean, I think it's a really interesting concept, and potentially it could be really useful to push us away from where we are now into a state where, if everyone is expecting to vote, perhaps we would more actively seek out information with which to make a good decision, and perhaps information would be more readily provided to us, because it's expected that we need to make a decision. Therefore, we need to help citizens do that. So it wouldn't be left to minute organisations like mine and others. However, as was said by Parth and Jez possibly as well, I think what is the problem we're trying to solve here? We don't. Voting in itself is not a benefit. The benefit comes from feeling like you've got a say in your future, and we need to know that when we participate, it's going to make a difference, and that compulsory voting isn't going to give us that. We need to make people feel like they actually have some kind of agency in their own future. So that's the broader challenge, and that is doable. And we've got great solutions. We've heard, participatory budgeting is a really clear example how you can give people that agency, and there's loads more examples. So it's doable. Mandatory voting could help nudge us along the way, but it's not necessarily the solution.
It's part of a journey rather than the solution per se. Thank you. And I love that it's doable kind of mantra. We've really got to remember that, just because things are this way now, they don't have to necessarily remain this way. Kathy, I can see you've got your hand up.
Yes, I don't think mandatory voting would be very democratic. And it's not going to. What we should be doing is encouraging people to vote, not fining them if they don't. I mean, people really need a bit of encouragement, because in local elections, it's almost always less than 50% vote. Some local elections only like 20% vote. And in my area, the new election we've got this coming week is the Police and Crime Commissioner. Now, a lot of people don't know much about police and crime commissioners, or are very interested in them. And some people have actually said, well, we're not going to vote because we don't believe in them. Well, in fact, the Liberal Democrats, and I'm a Lib Dem councillor, we have actually said that we don't want police and crime commissions, but if you vote for our candidate, they are going to be working to get towards getting rid of this post and providing something better.
Thank you for sharing that, Kathy. I'm gonna move on to Stuart. And Stuart, while you're gonna take the floor with answering the question or adding your bit in, we've also got a question on the chat for you, which is, do you think a Labour government would move to PR? So
Right, thanks. Yeah, so just on mandatory voting as well. I mean, I would agree with certainly what Jez said there about, there's something sort of unethical about forcing, people to vote, particularly if you're identifying that we want to try and get more people involved, particularly people further down the scale. And I cite Australia as an example. If we're still living in a first past the post world in the UK of a country that has that, but doesn't actually manage to achieve the standards of equality that you've got in PR countries, despite the fact that everybody has to vote in those elections. It actually ends up with its Labour Party getting a less centrist, a more left-wing score in most of the academic research that's done that compares these sort of things. But the results, whilst better than the UK, are not on a par with our brothers and sisters in the mainland with their PR systems. And then on the Labour Party and PR, I think it would appear ever greater demand and interest within the party for a move to PR. I think they voted it as part of their constitution now. But the big problem we've got, and this is another thing to do with first past the post, is that the Labour Party at the parliamentary level sees itself tied up in the interests of first past the post, because everybody would like to have, it would appear, at single party majority, right? So the Labour Party has this dilemma at parliamentary party level. What does it want more? Does it want power, or does it want to do, what the data now supports, and that is change to a system that allows a better level of equality to emerge?
Thank you. Parth, can I come back to you? You said you had some other bits to add before we went zooming off onto mandatory voting.
Yeah, I'm just trying to remember what they were. I think the first was the opening question about populism, which I think is a good question. So I think it's worth sort of separating populism as an idea, as a philosophy, from populist parties. Right, populism as an idea is the juxtaposition of sort of the will of the people against the elite. So that's the idea that a small group of people have captured control of the political process and they're acting against the majority interest. Right? Populist parties are quite different. They take that and they add nativism, they add xenophobia, they add authoritarianism. They are a real threat to democracy, I would say, because when they do form governments, and even when they don't form governments, a lot of ideologies and a lot of principles that counteract a large part of democracy: minority rights, freedom, equality, separation of powers. These are all quite important factors, and worth saying that populist parties are definitely the enemy of democracy. The question is, who is the champion of democracy? It's quite hard to find that today in the party system, right? We live in a party-based democracy, so the most important institution in our democracy is the political party. The problem, I would say, is that party system today is broken, right? I struggle really to find genuinely democratic parties across most advanced liberal capitalist democracies. And I think what we have are a bunch of parties that seem outdated. They're 20th century political parties trying to operate in the 21st century, and they're not quite. What they've done is withdrawn from civil society. Everywhere you look, parties have distanced themselves from civil society, where they were once entrenched with memberships or clubs, or tried to knock on people's doors and understand their interests and aggregate public opinion and translate that into coherent policy offer. Today, they seem to be up here talking to themselves, talking to business lobby groups, kind of working out their own sort of world. And that's what I would say the big problem is, that the party-based democracy, the party and democracy have almost split off each other. And I think that's quite toxic. And I don't know what the solution is to that. We're thinking quite hard about that, but that's where I would focus my interests.
Thank you very much. And just, I think, Vanessa, you put a question in the chat. I think some people touched on it already. She was asking about thoughts about lowering the voting age to 16. We've literally got a minute left. Does anybody want to jump in and talk about? I think, Jez, you kind of covered a little bit of this. Anybody else desperately want to jump in with thoughts on lowering the... Jez, come back to talking about lowering the voting age to 16.
I think there's a lot of evidence that if people start to vote at the age of 16, it becomes a lifelong habit. Whereas if you leave it to a bit later, they're starting to go to university, they've got very many distractions, and actually you see a fall off. And I would just put a case in Scotland, where it's a very progressive country with lots of very positive policies, where voting ages are 16 in Scottish elections, and in participatory budgeting in Scotland, it's often 12 or less. Wow. That people can get involved in spending public money. democracy is a habit, and we need to find ways to build that habit.
What a fantastic way to end the session. Thank you so much, Jez. Thank you so much, everybody that's joined us. I think Dario has put in the chat box here a link to our really, really short Google form just to get your thoughts and feedbacks on how this session went and ideas for what you might want to have sessions on in the future, or any speakers you'd like to hear from. We've also mentioned Dario's put in the chat here about our Fairness 5 pledges, which is how we're working with local councillors, local councils ahead of the local elections and past the local elections, for how they might want to adopt inequality reduction kind of measures in their work. So please have a look at those Fairness 5 pledges, and if you've got time to have a look at that Google form. After the session, we can send around a link to the recording, and links to people's presentations, and we can share those links again. If anybody has any other questions for the speakers, please feel free to send those to me, and I can forward those over. And once again, thank you so much, everybody, for your time. Thank you to our 4 fantastic speakers this evening. It's been a really interesting and exciting event ahead of for some people, local elections. For those of you who have them on May the 2nd, please try and make your voice heard, attempt to make your voice heard, join along, and we might be running something again ahead of the general election as well. So thank